Okay, great. It looks like we have some more people on now, so that's wonderful. We'll just jump in. So thank you all for joining us for our first Forest Steward Workshop of the year. This is going to be on centering anti-racism actions in the Green Seattle Partnership. I want to give a shout out to this year's youth ambassadors who are joining us today. Welcome to all of you. My name is Lynn Knapp, and I help coordinate these workshops. So during this workshop, we're going to discuss what we can do to address historical harms and racism that shaped our park system, build equitable programming moving forward, and support long-term forest and community health in Seattle. So I want to thank all of you for taking the time today to really consider the concepts that we're going to cover here and allow yourself to reflect on your biases as we go through them. So here is some basics, just some Zoom tips, a lot of which you're probably familiar with, but I like to go over them. All attendees are muted and have their videos off. This is a webinar. You can go ahead and use the chat or the Q&A functions at the bottom to reach me and the other presenters. We prefer you use that Q&A just so we can type answers and respond to you, and that will go out to all of the attendees. And then we'll have some time at the end for question and answer. This presentation is being recorded so that we can send it out to anyone who's not attending. And then closed captions can be turned on via the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. So for an outline for our agenda today, we're doing a brief welcome, that's now. And then we're gonna have a quick activity on the circles of identity. I sent out a PDF with that information ahead of this, just so you could kind of consider the activity and have that as we go into that. And then Belinda Chin is going to give us a great presentation on racism in park systems, natural areas, and the environmental movement, a lot of information about Seattle. And then Michael Yadrick is going to talk about the GSP anti-racism actions that are happening in 2021 and into the future. And then Jacob de Guzman is going to talk about resources for more learning, some of which we'll send out after the meeting. And then we'll have some time for questions. And then at the very end, we have a survey for all of you so that we can continue to improve these trainings. So going into community agreement. So as we talk about really important topics like addressing racism and our personal bias, sometimes it can feel uncomfortable. That's understandable. So these community agreements can make sure that we're all approaching this from a place of learning. So it's important to be present today, call each other in as we call each other out, create space for multiple truths, and speak from your own experience. Type from your own experience. Assume best actions, but recognize that intent is different from impact. Share gratitude for feedback. Notice the power dynamics and positionality, especially important in this conversation. And then expect imperfection and center learning and growth, and get used to uncomfortable conversations. It's a good thing. And with that, I'm gonna welcome Lisa to give us a land acknowledgement.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Lisa. I work with Seattle Parks and Recreation as a plant ecologist, as many of you guys know, I hope. And I am popping on the screen just briefly today to share a land acknowledgement. I won't be presenting otherwise, but I wanted to start by acknowledging this landscape in front of us. This is the space that we do our work in for the Green Seattle Partnership. You know, most obvious in front of us here is the West Duwamish Greenbelt. And I think it's really important in this work that we acknowledge that this space has been stewarded for time immemorial by Coast Salish people, including the Duwamish tribe, the Muckleshoot tribe, and the Suquamish tribe. And kind of modeling some of the community expectations that Lynn just shared, I think it's really important to recognize that this acknowledgement hasn't always been part of the Green Seattle Partnership's focus and work. And, you know, for somebody, myself, born and raised here in Seattle, product of Seattle Public Schools, I'm humbled to admit that I have was not taught, nor did I make the time to learn about the role of Indigenous people in the stewardship of this landscape. And that applies to, you know, K through 12, as well as my master's work in forestry. And so I think really critical to where we start this conversation today is to acknowledge the people who have stewarded this land, and to endeavor to continue working with them. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Lisa. All right, and next, Jacob, do you want to talk about the very brief activity?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Lisa, for that acknowledgement. Hello, everybody. My name is Jacob. I use he and they pronouns, and I'm working right now as a plant ecologist with Seattle Parks and Recreation. We're going to go through a very shortened version of this activity called Circles of Identity. Normally, I think we set aside more like 30 minutes for it, but because we want to kind of just use it as a jumping point, we're going to kind of do it more in 5 minutes. So hopefully you saw this and had a chance to familiarize yourself with it from Lynn's email earlier, but if not, we're going to go through sort of a short version of it. And so I want to introduce this exercise both as someone who has participated and as someone who has facilitated it. Because this exercise helps us remember that our identities are multifaceted. It prompts us to learn more about our individual identities. And by doing that, hopefully build empathy for other people and understanding that their identities are complex and can't be boiled down to generalizations, specifically based on race, gender, age, etc. So let's take a second to ground ourselves. Maybe you want to take a really big inhale and a really big exhale. Go ahead and close your eyes if you'd like. Turn off your camera if you like, as we begin to start to think about each dimension of identity. And starting at the very center, start to think about what makes up your own personality. This dimension includes the one of a kind, unique personality that makes us ourselves. Who are we? What are our personalities without our bodies, without our hobbies, not being attached to our social group? What are these elements that makes up your personality? Just gonna set a little timer for myself too, so I know where I'm at. Okay, moving on to the next concentric circle. These are called our internal dimensions, or I think of them also as our physical dimensions. And this dimension includes the first thing other people see in us. It includes our perceived race, gender, age, ability, and more. And these are things we generally have less control over. These are things that we're sort of born into. I think, so go ahead and think about those. And I think as we think about these, it's important to understand too that these physical internal dimensions are often things that a lot of generalizations can be made about a particular group of people. But as we go through this exercise, we'll see there's more to our identities than just these internal dimensions. So as we're looking at this one, what is your race? What is your age? What is your generation you belong to? The gender you identify with, the gender you're perceived as, your ability level, and so forth. I'm gonna take about 10 more seconds for that one. The next dimension we're going to look at is this next circle, the external dimensions found in yellow. External dimensions include a lot of things that are not something to see about us. They're virtually invisible as we look at people. These dimensions include our habits, our hobbies, how we present ourselves, and things that are more personal. As I mentioned, things we have more control over. So what are some of your external dimensions when you're thinking about this to yourself? Where are you located? Are you living in the city of Seattle? What do you like to do for fun? What are some things you do for recreation? Maybe what's your favorite flavor of ice cream? These are all factors that are virtually unseeable by other people when they look at us, but make up aspects of our identity. And we'll take another sort of 15 seconds, 10 seconds for that. And then as we look to our last attribute, these are in red, the organizational dimension. This dimension of our identity is based on how we organize ourselves in relationship to other people. It includes shared interests with other people, our organizational relationship to that shared group. And this organizational dimension can make a difference in how we see the world and how we act on a daily basis. It's important to note that we are all here organizationally today as people who are a part of the GSP Forest Steward program. And let's go ahead and think about, and these also can include maybe parts of our identity that are tied to our work, parts of identity that are tied to the social groups that we identify with, that we share with other people. And so go ahead and take about another 15 seconds and think about that. Cool. And so go ahead and start to wrap up your thoughts. Again, this is a great exercise to do on paper because you can really start to see all the elements of each of these dimensions that make up one person's identity, your own identity. And I wanted to introduce this, like I mentioned in the beginning, because I think as we explore our own identity with prompts, it allows us to realize that our own identities are not just tied to our race or our age or our ability, what people see, and that we have a multifaceted identity that by understanding what they are in ourselves and in other people, we can build more empathy for connection and to grow. And ultimately, as we see through this presentation, to sort of use as a jumping point for our journey in learning more about anti-racism. And so with that, I'm going to pause here and pass it to, I believe, Belinda, or back to Lynn. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jacob. Belinda, do you want to go ahead and take it from here? And yeah, just let me know when you want me to move the slide ahead.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Much appreciated. And good afternoon, Green Seattle Partnership volunteers. So glad to have this time with you today. And when I was asked to do this presentation, I was deeply honored. I've been involved intermittently with Green Seattle Partnership over many years, and really delighted. I was delighted and honored, to be asked to do this today and spend this time with you. So Lynn, next slide, please. All right, thank you. So in 2004, the City of Seattle launched the Race and Social Justice Initiative, explicitly making racial equity a government priority in recognition of the past and present harms to Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and other communities through city policies, practices, and procedures. Seattle Parks and Recreation was an early advocate of the initiative and has been working on becoming an anti-racist, multicultural organization. So the benefits of a public park system can be experienced by as many people as possible in every community in the city. This has and continues to be a constant effort that requires sustained perseverance to make the changes necessary. Next slide, please. So thank you again for this opportunity to speak briefly about the public lands that are managed by Seattle Parks and Recreation. This is a quote from Christopher Williams, and when he spoke these words, he was the interim superintendent, and now he is currently the deputy superintendent. And I quote, "We have implemented a myriad of morally based, well-intentioned programs and services in response to challenges we don't fully understand. Programs that have the unintended consequences of magnifying the challenges we are trying to overcome. And for me, what Christopher Williams is reflecting here is a condition of working in a government agency that is influenced by so many factors outside of itself. Some that are very helpful to the greater community, and some that are very narrow in their scope. And the need to balance for the greater good, it's a constant, it takes constant work and effort. So how did we get here? Let's begin by taking a step back in time to understand some of the historicity of this place we now know as Seattle. So let's consider geologic time, looking at Seattle through geologic time. About 13 to 15,000 years ago, there was a 3,300 foot deep ice sheet covering what we now know as the Puget Sound region. This ice sheet, 3,300 feet, to give you a sense of how thick that was, if you can imagine the Space Needle, it was about 5.5 Space Needles tall. So when this ice sheet melted away, it left behind many freshwater lakes and streaming waters, huge boulders, rocks, sand, and clay, as well as the familiar contours of peaks and valleys. And as GSP volunteers, I'm sure many of you have hands-on experience working through these glacial soils and are very, very familiar with it. The land that we are on, in addition to the glacial history, it was also formed by earthquakes and violent upheavals of nearby volcanoes. So in short, this place from sea level to mountaintop has been formed by fire and ice. Next slide, please. Hey, the beaches, wetlands, forests, meadows, and other habitats gave rise to and is home to a rich diversity of plants and animals. Next slide, please. In relationship with the tribes and bands of the Coast Salish peoples. And I would like to add on to what Lisa mentioned at the top of this presentation. I'd like to add on these words. Seattle Parks and Recreation staff acknowledge we occupy the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as a first step in honoring the land we stand on and resisting the erasure of Indigenous past, present, and future. So next slide, please. As people from around the world created ways to travel long distances, there is evidence of this movement to the North American continent by the 1500s. By the 1700s, European traders were in contact with Coast Salish people. By the 1840s, settlers were establishing long-term villages which displaced communities of Indigenous peoples, forcing them to move from their ancestral lands, basically moving them out of what we now know as Seattle and moving them out to the mudflats and beyond. Next slide, please. Colonialism has been a significant driving force in shaping world culture. Colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another sovereign nation, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. Global natural resources were taken, monetized, and consumed to the benefit of rich patrons and colonial powers. In the US, the period of colonialism came with the taking of land from native peoples, the enslavement of people from Africa, and indentureship of many additional peoples, the contradictions of this history with the founding national principles continue to be a struggle to the present day. Next slide, please. So colonialism built up a period of industrialization that fed into a boom in population growth, political turmoil, war, economic hardship, and more conditions that resulted in waves of mass migration within countries and worldwide immigration. Next slide, please. For Seattle, many of today's neighborhoods started as ethnic and cultural enclaves of interstate transplants, immigrants, and refugees. So for example, many Scandinavians from the Midwest in the late 1800s moved into and settled in Ballard. African Americans from the Deep South, Texas, Southwest, they came up to the Pacific Northwest with the Great Migration, many of them, and settled in the Central District. And Asians from across the Pacific formed community in what we now know as the International District Chinatown. Next slide. By the late 1800s, the negative environmental toll of industrialization inspired a back to nature and health movement, making public parks a focus for socializing, fresh air, and recreation. Next slide, please. The city of Seattle hired the Olmsted firm, known for its development of New York Central Park, to create a park system in 1903. Charles Olmsted, the gentleman with the pipe in the near center, facing to the left, is the principal that worked with Seattle. Frederick Law Olmsted, his father, was the founder of the firm and believed public parks were foundational to democracy by providing spaces for people of all backgrounds, ethnicities, races, to mingle and trade ideas, as well as to recreate for health and wellness. Next slide, please. It was not uncommon, again, for the philosophical ideals of this nation's founding to clash with the lived experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, immigrants, refugees, low-income residents, and people with limited English speaking skills. Institutionalized racism and discriminatory policies, practices, and procedures dictated where certain people could live, work, worship, and play. And Seattle did not escape this history. Next slide, please. The restrictive covenants of the late 1920s through the 1940s are an example of the racial and ethnic discrimination that imposed rules on the activities of so-called minorities in dominantly white neighborhoods. And these exclusionary rules extended themselves to the use of public parks and facilities within the same communities. So for example, if you've not seen these before, the language of these restrictive covenants is captured in the deeds, in the land and property deeds of homeowners. So some of this language still exists in current deeds. So from the Green Lake neighborhood, for example, it says, no person or persons of Asiatic, African, or Negro blood, lineage, or extraction that shall be permitted to occupy a portion of said property or any building thereon, except a domestic servant or servants who may actually and in good faith be employed by white occupants of such premises. From Ballard, no part of said property hereby conveyed shall ever be used or occupied by any Hebrew or by any person of the Ethiopian, Malay, or any Asiatic race. very, very specific language. During the term of Governor Christine Gregoire, legislation was passed to expunge this kind of restrictive covenant language from deeds. However, that language still exists, and just so that you know, that in 1948, the US Supreme Court did make racial restrictions like this illegal, but the practices that were established back then, they had such an influence that the influence of that language and the practices linger to this day. Next slide, please. So throughout the 1900s, so, you know, we just got through how the movement of certain peoples were controlled. People were also continuing to take control of the environment and forced and shaped it to meet needs. So in the meanwhile, this was going on, the consequences of these actions were building up. Next slide. Okay. So the once diverse forests of old growth trees were reduced over time to the current 28% canopy cover. And here I want to give a shout out to the Green Seattle Partnership volunteers, because your work has contributed to the stability of the canopy cover. And you could see how much we've lost. Like from 1972, the green area indicates 50% tree cover. And in 1996, the black on the map there indicates less than 50% tree cover. And then in 2016, this is a different kind of map, but you could see the green areas that represents the remaining 28% tree cover, which again, GSP volunteers are helping to stabilize. Thank you. Next slide.
Sorry, it's taking a second. Thinking about it though. Okay, there we go.
Thank you. So this is a listing from Washington Fish and Wildlife. So with native natural habitats being greatly reduced or destroyed, the impacts to flora and fauna species, they now come under descriptors of being endangered, threatened, or sensitive. The next slide, please. The history of institutionalized racism is imprinted in the landscape of Seattle. So the map in the center shows the differences in canopy cover across the city. The lighter the color, the fewer the number of trees. The map to the left is a heat map, which is very relevant to today. The redder the color, the hotter those areas are during high temperature events. The map to the far right shows communities by racial identity. The high density Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities are shown by dark purple. All three maps together show the work of redlining. And so you see that the communities of color have the least number of trees and are suffering the impacts of the most heat, even as we speak here. So redlining, if that is an unfamiliar term, is the sanctioned segregation by real estate, banking, and other institutions over time. It is illegal to do that. However, the practices linger in very sneaky ways. Added to the impacts of redlining are the proximity to industry, traffic, noise, and that has serious impacts to health and wellness. Next, please. So it's taken less than 200 years to put our regional ecosystems on artificial life support. And the old growth forest, forests that inhabited this region, they were established residency thousands and thousands of years prior to the emergence of the human species. So in geologic time, those ancient trees are the geological ancestors of humans. They are our elders. There are now 2 remnant stands of old growth. And quickly, can people say where those are? In Seattle, those 2 remaining remnant stands? And I'll tell you, at Seward and Schmitz. If that's what you said, you're right. Next slide, please. The Pacific Northwest depends on snowpack to meet its water needs, and the region's power supply is based on water stored as snow. As the climate of the Pacific Northwest warms, more winter precipitation is falling as rain rather than snow compared with historic averages. And a lot of the evergreen forest that was here has been replaced by deciduous trees, which makes a difference to how water is stored and how it runs in our area now. Next slide, please. Something to consider, the US Census has forecasted that the US population will reach 50% or more Black, Indigenous people of color by 2040. And due to historic racial discrimination and multiple barriers, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are not well represented in environmental professions, especially in leadership positions. Now, consider this in light of also that entry into the sciences has declined overall. Now, the lack of people of color is disproportionate to the strong Black, Indigenous, people of color concern and interest in environmental issues. They are a strong advocacy constituency. And so reaching out to and making paths open to employment, to environmental professions is definitely something that is very worthy of considering. And it's a growth opportunity. It's a growth opportunity and leaning towards the direction of healing and moving towards environmental justice. Next slide, please. Planning is more important now than at any previous time in human history, given the intersectionality of climate change, pandemic, racial upheaval, socioeconomic, and political unrest. These are changes to Seattle within the past 5 years. A lot of growth, a lot of change, a lot of hardening of the landscape. Next slide, please. And E.O. Wilson, when I read this in The Diversity of Life, it really touched me and it influences me in my work to this day. To quote, "Our troubles arise from the fact that we do not know what we are and cannot agree on what we want to be. The primary cause of this intellectual failure is ignorance of our origins. Humanity is a part of nature, a species that evolved among other species. The more closely we identify ourselves with the rest of life, the more quickly we will be able to discover the knowledge on which an enduring ethic, a sense of preferred direction, can be built." Next slide, please. We are at a convergence and intersection of several important timelines: the geologic, the indigenous, flora and fauna, and human. We are living with the decisions made by people who came before us. Let us acknowledge them for making it possible for us to be here today and for the lessons they have taught us. And for us to consider is, what lessons will we take forward at this critical juncture? Next slide, please. Many disciplines of science continue to demonstrate the connectedness of life webs on Earth. Doctors Suzanne Simard and Forrester Peter Wollbein have revealed the intimate interdependence of trees and forests with each other, be they of the same species or not. Trees by themselves have shown to suffer. some of the most pristine forests are those in the care of indigenous peoples in relationship with them. The next slide, please. Taking up the call from Dr. Simard and Forrester Wollvine, let us learn from our elders, the trees. I'm hoping that we can work together to heal our relationships with each other as human beings and see each other through different eyes, as Jacob guided us to see, and to heal with Mother Earth as well. And 5 ways that we can do that work is through continuing to learn how to undo the racist practices that is part of our history, to work in equality and equity, to hone our empathy, and we can do that by understanding ourselves better, to work in allyship, to be of mutual aid to each other. And ultimately, it's about love, doing our work from a place of love. Thank you very much for the privilege of your time. And thank you to the people who contributed to making this slide presentation possible. And back to you, Lynn. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Belinda. Got so much to consider. Thank you. Next up, Michael. I'll give you control of the screen here.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Michael, and I am one of the plant ecologists at Seattle Parks and Recreation. And yeah, if y'all of you don't know me, I use he, him pronouns. I identify as white, and more I've been identifying more and more as a settler here, and just taking the cue from Jacob's exercise at the beginning. Just some of those things you might be able to see from the outside, but some things you can't. My ancestors were farmers. I have some extended family that were loggers. I am a first generation plant ecologist though, so I don't have the benefit of generations of ecologists lineage that comes before me. So I've come to realize I don't know as much as I think I do sometimes about the forest. So I am grateful to be here speaking to you about our actions we are taking to continue to get in right relationship, not only with the earth, but with each other. And I wanted to start with this quote from my favorite author right now, Adrian Marie Brown. She is the author of Emergent Strategy. She also wrote this cool book called Pleasure Activism, if you're ever into it. She's a doula. She has 2 podcasts. She's really amazing. And I came upon her. I was listening actually to this book called All We Can Save, which is this compilation of women's stories about climate change. And specifically, I was listening to this book. It was a little embarrassing. I divulged this yesterday. I didn't know if I was going to tell a story. I was listening to her chapter at the gym. That's when I first heard this. I didn't know anything about her before. And this piece, I don't know which machine I was on, but I was in the middle of some exercise, and this quote just like pretty much stopped me in my tracks. And really specifically, so she talks about emergence. A lot of folks think that is like something we talk about emergent plants that like grow out of water, but it's kind of not. But kind of taking this, continuing on with what Belinda was saying. Like emergence is this concept of the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. So I'll say that again. So the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. So, you know, just thinking about that web of life that we have underneath us, the diversity of life that we really we wish for in our forests is also that diversity that we really want to sort of harness and cultivate in our community, in our human communities as well. I think this is like speaks to every tree hugger's sort of love language, right? But really showing us that adaptation, and that word adaptation was, I think, is important to me, and that we were intentional. Specifically, I wish it was, I'm sitting in the shade right now, but if you all were in the sun today or tomorrow, just planning intentionally about, adapting to like things we're experiencing every day, like climate change, can be super important. So moving on, I also wanted to bring this up, I think not going too far back, but in the recent past, this paper, I learned a lot from this publication. This Indigenous scholar, her name is Jessica Hernandez, from the University of Washington. I feel she, I'm pretty sure she continues to teach at University of Washington in Bothell. And I saw her last in person in January at this Natural Area Symposium at the University of Washington Center for Urban Horticulture. So she presented on these topics about indigenizing restoration. And then she published this paper soon thereafter. She did too reach out to us in advance, like way in advance, when she was first starting on her community work at Daybreak Star in kind of on the fringes of Magnolia and Discovery Park. I will let everyone know. I don't think she's in the audience today, but I do apologize for not. She invited us in to help or to be a part of this research, and we did not step up. Personally, there's a bit of a long story, but it just seemed like a lot of excuses. But yeah, we did not support her. So I think but maybe her research was better for it, because in a bit, if you read this article, and I'll put a link to it in the chat if I can't. Nope, I can't. Somebody else could maybe, or I'll put it in later. You know, it was a bit critical of Seattle Parks and Recreation's restoration. And really, I think it was a good reminder. There's some lessons learned, but a good reminder about, you know, the way that, you know, the way we see the forest, and, you know, with this enclosure of the commons, you know, about this parcelization that we think of, like these boundaries about, like, you know, this is forest, you know, this is not forest, this is a garden, this is not, things like that. Also, just how we just consider things like places like that are wastelands, like places that are covered in ivy or blackberry are wastelands. But in some ways, we just, you know, weeds are organisms that we just we don't have, you know, we have a ill-formed relationship with sometimes. The other thing was just the concept of abundance, and just that the earth is abundant, and that's something that we should remember. So yeah, I encourage you all to read this, and yeah, it's a good read. Yeah, so think about, you know, I want to give you a bit of an update about, you know, you all kind of know the story about where GSP came from and who we are, and that concept can change, you know, over time. We think of, like, I'm the public side of the partnership. Belinda said she's like sporadically involved in the partnership, you know, and I do think she's definitely, I don't know, she didn't mention it, but had some influence over some of the curriculum, the early K through 12 curriculum that we employed years ago. There are community members out there in different forms or fashions that are involved, either actually digging in the dirt, doing the work, or, you know, giving their opinions, or, you know, involved in other ways. We have professional crews, you know, a handful of professional crews are out there, and they have a very intimate relationship with the forest, you know, because they are in and out of it every day. And then these partner organizations, some of whom we invest we use our public dollars that we're receiving to support them. And these are like community powered programs that have been elevated in one fashion or another. So yeah, and just to go back, you know, our program has been built on some very explicit bias about what we value, as well as our implicit biases, and especially just, you know, circling, kind of going back just a little, you know, flashback in time. In December of 2020, we hosted this this great workshop with Dr. Christopher Schell, and I think you all were encouraged to watch that if you hadn't seen that. And you know, part of our process is, you know, in different forms or fashion, going out and listening to community and hearing what, you know, people want from the program, and then turning around and hopefully doing something about it, right? So I just do, people that were involved in December, we want to hear that feedback. I think Lynn's going to actually ask you to do another survey at the end of this whole thing. We want to let you know that we actually do read those comments, and we sit with them and reflect on them. And this is what we heard from the last time. And we heard a bunch of stuff, but I did categorize this, you know, in several different ways. And this is what we heard, that obviously that justice needs to be at the forefront of our work. We need to listen. I think we're really, this workshop, we're really focused on like the relationships and how important relationships are, communication, sharing. So not only going through these workshops, but turning around and sharing what we learn with others, providing career and leadership opportunities for the younger generation, and some focus on language. We also heard, you know, on different ends of the spectrum. You know, one thing I read was like, don't make white people feel guilty. There's that viewpoint. And then on the other end, it was inclusion is the language of gatekeeping, and we should really be focused on giving land back to the Duwamish tribe. So kind of different, and people in like my own racial development and your own racial development, like people are in different stages of, and have, you know, a variety of feelings about this sort of work. Yeah, so if you don't know, we do, you know, in the past, in 2017, we created this update to the strategic plan, the original strategic plan of GSP, and we created these really, like a really fancy plan and really solid performance metrics, right? I don't know if you all know this, but these are embedded within the plan. And we measure, we do intentionally plan from our centralized fashion of like plan ecologists anyway, we do try to steer the ship, and we measure ourselves against this constantly and every year, if you don't know. And from these, you know, from these actions, we know what we look like. We know what our composition looks like, racially, to a certain extent, age-wise, and in other ways, through data. So, and the other one is that we intentionally, you know, through the years, we started prioritizing parks that were largely had a community stewardship presence already, salmon-bearing streams, forests that look good to get from the get-go, right? So we know we've always been in the Olmsted parks, those parks that have been in the system forever. We're not going to walk away from them, but we know we need to be active in other communities. So you'll see our boots on the ground in Seward Park, on the boulevards. However, you will see us also in those ravines, or in these equity focus areas in different parts of town. And we can map this, and again, we measure ourselves against that. But the thing is, like, it's one thing to measure ourselves against, have these performance metrics. It's another thing to be like really start to think about key behavior, indicators of key behaviors change, right? So, and really be explicit about like what our biases are, and really start to do some really if we haven't already, if I have not started to do this work, we know it's time, because as we are facing these overlapping crises in our life today, or have been for a while, you know, people have been living through not only COVID, at least for the last year and a half, but you know, this racial reckoning, economic disparities within the community. You know, COVID's been fine for some people. Some people are doing well, but other people have, you know, lost their jobs, losing their homes. So we need to step up and provide, remake our program to best serve, or remake Seattle Parks and Recreation so we can best serve people who are most in need. And then also, I feel like today is one of the best days to talk about the climate disruption. And most recently, I don't know if you all read the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sixth annual, you know, 6 reports, you know, that came out earlier this week, and just how dire things are. So yeah, and this is kind of how we really start to measure ourselves. At Seattle Parks and Recreation, we do have the Race and Social Justice Initiative. We do have required trainings, as well as we have like every opportunity to do like optional self work. So and this is something, this like framework annually after our like these big annual trainings, we often will query ourselves where we sit on this spectrum. And, you know, there's 6 columns here spanning the spectrum from, right, on the left-hand side, the exclusive like old boys club sort of thing, where it's like, we're not giving up any power and privilege at all. And over to where I think we endeavor to be is over on the right-hand side of the spectrum, with the fully functioning, like we're optimal human beings, like in a multicultural society. And so there's a lot of words on here, I understand. So I do want to sit with this for a little bit and let you kind of self-reflect, either as, and I do encourage you, yeah, if you just want it in the chat. Is there a chat? There's a chat, sorry, in the chat. Numbering 1 through 6, it'd be good just if you could ping us with a number where you think we sit. And I honestly, and it could be from your own perspective, from GSP as a whole, or within your like own like little subgroup in your neighborhood or in your project, where you think you are, where you think we are. I am really surprised somehow. I think the first time I took this, I was surprised, and I recalibrated really quickly with my coworkers where we all thought we were. Me coming from a fairly kind of white monocultural nonprofit background, even notwithstanding my time in the Peace Corps, just working in proximity with people that are non-white was like amazing to me. But just being in close proximity doesn't mean like we're an equitable organization or we're sharing power. So if you can, yeah, just look towards like what we aspire to be, I think, on this like redefining and multicultural ends of the spectrum. And we can start to think about like what those real actions look like. So, and this is how, you know, if you haven't been a part of, if you weren't at the Duwamish Longhouse workshop a couple years ago, you know, these are the things that where we're training, like our trainings have changed. So not only are we teaching folks how to like dig blackberry out and put a planted Douglas fir in the ground, we have for years, I think, started to work on, you know, how to do the things, how to work with youth, and these more like kind of soft social skills, right? There's also this Lisa Ciecko and Jacob de Guzman has been working with this early arrivals program with the Environmental Coalition of South Seattle, and also sitting in on some listening sessions with them about what forest stewardship looks like in their community. There's for several years, been supporting the African Elders Program with Tilth Alliance at the Rainier Beecher and Farm Wetland. And then Dirt Corps is one of the newer partners in the program. And we have the bandwidth to form more partnerships and to, work with those to support, financially and morally some of these, community powered programs. And I feel like it is a great privilege, and I think there's mutual benefit in us doing so. So as I wrap up here, I just want to leave you all with, just starting to think outside of our comfort zones about what restoration is and isn't. And I do, these are some things that are like we're doing, and there's some other things that are like, down the road, because we can't just, flip a switch. There's going to be a lot of processing. There's past traumas. There's harms that we may very well have committed. I think the important thing is we're doing with this self-study and these workshops like we're doing today, talking about what we're doing. We are working on changing our language, specifically around our relationship with plants. So I think it very much is important to think about like the topic or that theme of nativeness. Like I told you, like I was a settler, like I'm not native to this place. And it speaks to like, a plant is native or not native. Sometimes we think it's grounded in science, but it can be fairly arbitrary, that distinction. And then also speaks to belonging too, like who do we think belongs in the forest and who do we think doesn't belong in our forest, right? Changing names, so place names, we're moving away from naming things after people. So the eponymous naming, even switching like the name. We were talking about oaks today, right? So we're like, why is the oak that we live with here called Gary Oak? Why is it called why does it belong in Oregon when the original name was Chajats? We're hiring, working with BIPOC-led organizations. So within a few weeks, we are going to have an expanded suite of contractors to work with, and we did very intentional outreach to expand the pool of folks with whom we're working. So, and also I think if I can leave you with anything is like supporting participatory budgeting, right? So something can be kind of radical, but like we should have a choice about where we spend our public funds, and that includes GSP, like where we spend the GSP dollars. Like that balance between like going through acres with crews, or are we supporting those community powered programs more? Where are in the city, that big pie, and there's lots of public funding in Seattle, like what are we spending money on? So who gets the biggest part of the pie and why, and it's pretty clear that we don't need to be spending money some places when it doesn't benefit particularly historically excluded communities. So I can leave you with that. Thank you very much for the time up on stage here. I'm going to turn it over to Lynn and Jacob.
Thanks, Michael. It's really been great to see the changes over the program in the last few years that I've been involved, but yeah, definitely more work to do and lots to consider. So thank you. And yeah, of course, we'll get to the survey at the end of this. Just want to remind people to please put any questions that you have in the Q&A. We'll have some time after Jacob's presentation to go over those. Just wanted to remind you that's still there. Okay, so I'm going to give you control, Jacob. Let me get you to your slide. There you go.
Cool. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for that overview, Michael. It was really informative and great. Thank you, Belinda, before that too. I think all really great and complimentary information as part of this presentation. As I mentioned before, I'm Jacob, working as a plant ecologist with Seattle Parks. And we're going to get to some of the resources here that we're going to look at as learning to participate in centering anti-racism and participating in more anti-racism action. Click on the screen. Cool. So I want to start with a quote That seems to be the things we're all starting with, right? From Angela Davis. And it's that in a racist society, in a society with institutional racism, we can see it's not enough to be not racist. We must be anti-racist. And I think sometimes for me, it's been like, how do I go about doing that? Or what does that mean? Or I know it's easy to feel immobilized or stuck. And so as I go over some of these resources, instead of just being like, here are resources, go for it, I'm going to kind of speak to how to use them or some ways to engage with them that maybe give them a little more tread, a little more to engage them with in a way that helps build and learn. And so I think in my journey too, one of the things that I've learned about, you know, my role, my intersectional identity, about my place in learning about and participating in anti-racism, one of the best things I've learned to do is to listen, and to listen to the folks that are most affected by racism and those intersections of oppressive systems. And often can be Black women, queer and trans Black people, people of color, Indigenous people. And this is a resource we've included in a suite of resources we're going to show you later. But it's 10 keys to everyday anti-racism from this organization called the Anti-Racist Table, authored by Kirsten Ivy Colson and Lynn Turner. And we're going to go over the first 5, give you a little taste so you can go over the next 5 on your own in due time. I think these ways really illustrate sort of ways to engage with these resources in a meaningful way where we can learn from them. So the first key is education. In this article, they talk about that at the heart of racism is denial. If we are not learning about something, if we're not constantly expanding our perspectives on something, it's easy to stagnate and feel like we've checked a box, but we aren't continually growing. And where there is discomfort, there is growth. So it says, you know, systematic racism, as we've seen from Belinda's practice, reveals the laws and policies implemented to support white supremacy and those cultural norms and rules that created anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism. Starting with education as one of our keys. The next key is intention. Like starting any new habit, anti-racism requires a conscious decision to pursue it as a goal and a way of being. I think about it also of like, you know, our progression of being people who care for the forest. Like it takes intention to learn some of the skills that are needed, but with like any new habit, as we build intention around and intentionality around how we want to do things, it allows us to become habit. It allows us to become more natural. The third key is courage. It's no myth for me. I think for a lot of folks that facing facts about racism, white privilege, and white supremacy is difficult. It's difficult work. It can be painful to learn about, especially if we benefit from white privilege, and just untangling and learning about those systems that came before us and our place in dismantling them. But I think, yeah, having courage, choosing to lean into uncomfortability is where some of the most dynamic and most important growth comes from, especially, I don't know, I found that in my experience. Our fourth key we're going to look at is individuality. I just kind of spoke to this in the activity that I facilitated in the beginning, and that seeing another person's individuality means noticing the details and qualities, both positive and negative, that set them apart from the group. And so, you know, there are generalizations we've been taught, that we've internalized about specific race groups, about specific generations, but that our individuality really allows us to transcend those things and give us, you know, the complexity that we are as individuals. And I also want to like highlight too, and keep in balance that, you know, we should value individuality, and we should also simultaneously value our collective, the collective way we do things and the collective way that we take care of the forest or engage with our communities. And the fifth one is humanity. To kind of go back to the first slide, just as denial is at the heart of racism, so seeing humanity in others is at the heart of anti-racism. And I think that by really leaning into this work, by taking action, by learning, going through these 5 keys and the other 5 that are included in the article, learning more about anti-racism though it is uncomfortable, also allows us to engage with our own humanity more deeply, because we get to see the systems for what they are, and then begin to, mentally deconstruct them, and then eventually, we'll find our place in deconstructing them within these systems that we live in. And then there are many more. We have this suite of resources we put together. I kind of was speaking from the 10 keys of 10 keys of everyday anti-racism, but there's a Word documented PDF we're going to share with you that has some really amazing, really great just reading material to start with as part of that education piece. The 10 keys we kind of have been going over. The building a relational culture is really amazing to just kind of like highlight sort of things I've been taught, and things that we want to transition to as we look to a more multicultural, inclusive way of being. I think that these different resources speak to different facets, different elements of engaging in anti-racism action. And I think one that has a suite that I really love is the Sierra Club resource, where it kind of gives the one-on-one and how we connect anti-racism and environmentalism, and why environmentalism needs anti-racism action for a myriad of reasons we've kind of gone over. There is the equity and environment agenda I've included that Belinda talked about. I don't have it here on the slide, but there's also the indigenizing restoration doc is also included in there. And then this really great resource that I want to highlight too is this Seattle Neighborhoods, Department of Neighborhoods kind of snapshots, and they highlight more resources essentially for community engagement. Talks like a really definitive look at like what are the demographics of a neighborhood, what are the resources, what are the community hubs that exist in a neighborhood for potential to collaborate further with those folks that are adjacent to the parks that you steward, the forested parklands you steward. And so you'll see that shortly. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Lynn. Thank you all so much for your time today.
Thanks, Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll send out all of these resources soon. Lots of learning can come from that. I especially appreciate those neighborhood snapshots. It's also cool to sort of look at your neighborhood and neighborhoods around you, and see what the makeup is of your neighbors. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing screen so that you can see all of our videos a little larger for this piece. And I see we have a couple of things in the chat and in the Q&A here. So I have a question. This is a good one. I'll open it up to anyone on the panel. How do members of this panel define race in the context of becoming anti-racist? From my understanding, race and ethnicity are social constructs. As one with mixed heritage, I still do not know how to identify myself yet I feel othered when I am in majority white spaces. It's a big question. Oh, Jacob?
It's a great question. I feel like, because of my experience, I can speak to this a little bit. I'm also somebody with mixed heritage, though I don't always present white. I'm not always perceived as white in spaces. But on my mother's side, I have, an entire family of European American heritage. I think as we look at race, when I think about race, it's important to note that, yes, these are social constructs, but these are social constructs with very real impacts of what they've done to people. And when I think about defining race, I think about who is most affected by racism. And it tends to be, especially in the States, Black folks and Indigenous folks. And I think, it doesn't help to create sort of like discrimination Olympics, but I do think that for those that have a very particular history in the States, particularly, those are the folks that I look to, and I want to hear from them most specifically because they have a particular experience I don't have access to, but it is a valid experience and something that through their emotional labor are able to teach us. And, you know, we can find ways to reciprocate them for their emotional labor, for their care. And so I think there's a lot of, I am happy to follow up with Celeste. I think there's a lot of also really great literature about mixed identity and like the stuff that you feel is very valid and feeling othered by both sides of maybe your heritage. I won't speak to your experience, but I know I've experienced that. I can't think of this author right off the top of the head, but there's a lot of research on that. I think that's also part of this melting pot of the states where folks are becoming, they're more and more mixed race folks as we sort of blend and melt together. And yeah, I want to pause there, but yeah, I think I hope I answered kind of the gist of the question there. And it looks like Belinda has something to add.
Yeah, Belinda.
I'd like to add on that race, in terms of the two terms that you bring up, race and ethnicity. Ethnicity is related to culture, and culture is a direct relationship with the lands and resources from which peoples are associated with. And in the immigration and migration of peoples within the United States, the ethnicity, and especially related to like Western Europeans, a lot of ethnicity was sacrificed. Ethnic identity was sacrificed on behalf of this very specious, made up thing called race. So there is no genetic race, genetic underpinnings or foundations for race. Ethnicity, again, has more authentic relationship with the earth and with culture. So, and race, as Jacob mentioned before, that is all based on power and power over, in particular, based on skin color. And as Jacob mentioned, you know, the darker the skin, within this country, the practice has been, you know, the worse the oppression. So yeah, and I hear you about mixed heritage, and we have an opportunity here. The industrialization, you know, that has happened in this country and across the globe actually has created this big separation of human beings from the earth, and so these questions about identity, it is I can appreciate it from that disconnection, and from that, you know, arms, just this movement to like make human beings this lone tree, right, in the middle of a clear cut. You know, we're learning from science that doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So I appreciate the science, you know, and showing how interdependent we really are, you know, not only flora and fauna, but also human beings. So hope that helps. Thank you both for the input on that question. It's a big one for sure. This is on a slightly different page, but what are your ideas and suggestions for how forest stewards can connect with community members that are underrepresented in work parties? I know this is something we've talked a little bit about in the past. It may have been a little while since we've had a workshop on it. But in addition to that first question, are there any relationships you've developed on a macro level that could help us make community connections on a micro level? Lisa, Michael, I'm kind of looking at you first.
I can jump in and speak. Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think, especially for the forest stewards and partner organization staff that are part of this call right now, I think that you're kind of zooming in, right, to kind of where your work connects with community. And oftentimes that is at events and parks. And so, yeah, I would suggest, I mean, I think the word relationship has come up a lot in this conversation today. And I think that's really, for me, right at the center of how to approach this work, is to really consider where relationships that you have in the community exist and where you can start developing those. Because I think we see the most successful events and engagement with communities who have not commonly been part of Green Seattle Partnership events through that relationship development. That somebody knows somebody introduced somebody made a call and said, hey, I'd like to invite you to this park. And, you know, this is the kind of stuff that we're working on, but also, what do you need and what do you want out of an event? I think it's really critical to spend the time and really hear from folks about what would make an event appealing to them. In some cases, the word work party is kind of a trigger in and of itself. It's like, what is a work party? Is it a party? Is there going to be food there? No, maybe not. Or, you know, having, you know, in Cedar and in our kind of standard GSP events, there's this like real structure to stuff that doesn't work for everybody, and definitely doesn't work for all communities. And so really thinking through kind of what the barriers are to participation and addressing some of those and how you create an event. But again, from that place of relationship with folks in your community. And I do believe, yes, that there are things that we're working on at the macro level. I would say the work with ECOS and hearing directly from community members about what would be appealing is something that we will make an effort to share. And I think that there are a couple of resources that we can include as part of the follow-up to this workshop that are referenced on the website already, are in development right now, that we can make sure to get out to y'all. Michael, anything to add? Or Jacob or Belinda?
Yeah, I will just add, yeah, if people have organizations you all think we may want to reach out to, you can let us know. I will say, you know, in past, sort of in the past, way back machine, I can remember asking this question, like, who should we connect to? And everyone's like, what about Amazon and Microsoft? Those guys have lots of time and money. You know, we need them to come and, you know, dig up blackberries. And we're like, kind of roll our eyes. We're like, well, really, we don't want to be in a relationship with those guys. So, I mean, we could, but like, getting in bed just with corporate partners. I think the important things is to start on the ground level. So I often think of like just concentric circles, like often around your park, like that's the cozy space. Those are your real neighbors. However, we know there's neighborhoods we don't work in because there's no forest there because of some of the reasons that Belinda outlined. So unfortunately, we were at the Duwamish River Festival on Saturday. However, there's not really any GSP sites there because there's no forest. You know, downtown, Soto, Georgetown. Unfortunately, I'm just like a tourist there. So I think even bringing people to, I'm sorry, I'm going off track about answering your question, but other opportunities that don't include work in the park land. We've always, for several years now, we've talked about extending our work or our, you know, sense of, you know, relationship with each other and the earth, like beyond park borders too. So I think we really should think about like other ways we can do that too. So kind of bringing the forest along with us, you know, everywhere we go.
Mm-hmm. And I want to just add a little bit to both Michael and Lisa's piece. I think that, you know, there is, again, yeah, a part of trying to engage with folks in a way that is meaningful and is relational, centers relationship. I think there's a way to want to, like, I think there's a need or a desire to like check boxes, and I know that's not what this is about. But that, you know, in engaging with folks, that you are also figuring out a way to where you can sort of mutually reciprocate with one another, that you're not just asking for their labor, but you're asking to include them and honor their experience and their, you know, their place in the community.
And I'd like to add on about that's where the neighborhood snapshots are just so helpful, because it lists out community-based organizations that may have shared interests in restoration. Now, their approach to the restoration may be different from a place you know, that GSP volunteers are coming from. But as a for example, Beacon Hill suffers from being on the pathway of the airport. So they get a lot of flyovers, you know, from the airplanes. And so the sound, so planting more trees in the Beacon Hill area would be great for sound buffering. And so that could be a possible kind of relevant connection with community groups in doing a restoration project, as a for example. And then if I may, Janet has a question about the diversity piece and the data. And I don't know, I may have failed to indicate, I am one of the co-leads of the Race and Social Justice Change Team for Seattle Parks and Recreation. And this question about getting data is a constant pursuit, constant question. One of the things that we don't want to do is to tokenize people. And so one of the ways that has been used to gather this information is to gather it anonymously. And so there have been, this method was vetted by Seattle Public Utilities, where people just anonymously filled out their diversity information. And that has actually helped a lot. And I know that in certain circles within Parks and Recreation, we have applied that ourselves. So, and this is an evolving science, to be honest with you, to do this kind of tracking with respect and dignity and not to tokenize. That is a big challenge. So thank you.
Yeah, I had a response to that too, which was, it's always important to share the why. And if you don't know the why you're collecting the information, like as a forest steward, I think it's important to ask your plant ecologist about it, because I think one of the ways to not make this tokenizing is to say, here's exactly what we do with that. We take that data and that helps us identify what communities we want to support with new partnerships that GSP invests in, or, here's why we care. We're not just collecting it to put the data in a report and then say, go, good, we're doing a good job, right? Like there's things that come of that and what those are. So just something to reflect on. Like if you don't have the why, then it definitely can feel like a tokenizing effort. Lisa, I think you were going to say something too.
Oh, I was just going to offer a little bit of information on the logistics of that data collection. I agree that it is really important to understand the why. It's also not the easiest thing within our programming to get a good sample. And so, over the past several years, we've spent some time randomly selecting events and having in-person, having staff or having staff attend the events and collect data. And it's something that without going too into detail, it's something that we're continuing to work on. And I think as much as it's feasible to have folks register themselves on CEDAR, that's really the best anonymous place to have that data collection happen. But I think we still need to continue to consider other ways to gather information, because we are Jenna, your work with schools means that we're often not collecting any information on youth participation, and a lot of the programming happens outside of CEDAR, and we have a lot of our partner organizations leading work that's not capturing data. So it's a question mark, and as Belinda indicated, I like that it is an evolving science for sure, something that we are continuing to learn about.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we have just 3 more minutes left, so I'll fit one more in. The last question, I was at the Duwamish River Festival as well and learned about a new park being created, the Duwamish River People's Park at Terminal 117. Could GSP work in the future at restoration of the Duwamish River with land stewards or river stewards? Reflections on that, that great idea. I feel like I remember a river stewards program. Maybe it's through SPU. Is that right? I don't know if anyone else recalls this or if it's still active, but.
Right, long ago, there used to be a Creek Stewards program. In the South.
Creek Stewards, that was it.
Some of the people on this call might have been original Creek Stewards. Yeah, I think it's worth understanding kind of, and again, like on that relationship, trying to figure out if there's a role for Green Seattle Partnership, if there's a way that we can contribute to the new park development. If it's at Terminal 117, does that mean it's actual Port of Seattle property? So maybe not Seattle Parks, but I do know that there's acquisition from Seattle Parks happening along the Duwamish. Whether or not it involves stretches of habitat work that we could contribute to, I don't know, but we'll definitely be watching for that. And I think, as much as there's not work right on the river, the West Duwamish and the East Duwamish Greenbelts are really critical infrastructure in our city and spaces where we're really active. So we'll continue to do work in those neighborhoods through those spaces.
Thank you. Yeah, always open to the ideas. I think I can speak for Jacob, Lisa, Michael, and Belinda in that if there's ever ideas, reflections that you want to share, I'm assuming they all have a pretty open door policy about that. Great. All right, wonderful. Well, I just want to thank all of you for attending and all of our speakers for taking the time. This presentation is recorded and we'll send out the recording with the resources we discussed. When I end this Zoom webinar, you'll get a pop-up in a browser with the survey. It's just 5 questions. So if you can take just a couple of minutes to fill that out, it's really helpful for us to help design programming, and there will be another spot there for your ideas. So thanks again, everyone. And we'll see you for another Forest Steward workshop soon.